The aftermath of the Versailles Treaty had left the German Navy much reduced. From the second most powerful fleet on Earth, they were now restricted to just 6 pre-dreadnought battleships in a world where everybody else had super-dreadnoughts, 6 light cruisers, and this was the pre-Washington Treaty sense of the word, a dozen destroyers, and a dozen torpedo boats. No submarines, no aircraft, no airships. And further, when this small force began to age out, the pre-dreadnoughts could only be replaced by ships displacing up to 10,000 tons, the cruisers were limited to 6,000, the destroyers to a mere 800, and even the dozen torpedo boats were regulated. They couldn't exceed 200 tons. While incredibly strict, it also opened up a small opportunity for the Reichsmarine, which was what the German Navy was now called. Back in World War I, the Italians had enjoyed success with their Mars boats. The British had introduced a similar concept with their coastal motorboats, or CMBs, in the latter part of the war, and to be fair, the Kaiserliche Marine wasn't entirely idle in this area either. They'd first tried to develop remote control explosive motorboats. Although somewhat short range and needing a command vessel nearby since they had to use wire guidance rather than radio guidance, these Schnellboote had essentially been an attempt to devise a surface-running guided torpedo to try and deal with British forces operating near German-held areas of France, Belgium and the Netherlands, since the largest targets, monitors, were bulged very heavily against torpedo strikes, but these defences thinned out closer to the waterline, and the surface-borne nature of these craft made sense since they could then bypass a monitor's defences, or at least most of them. However, quick tracking and fast-firing small guns were numerous aboard the destroyers and various other craft that were escorting the monitors, and so attempts to use these small suicide attack craft never really worked out that well. But the fleet had also experimented with another kind of small craft. This one was manned, known as a Luftschiff-Motorboote, because it used the same engines as those which were used in the Zeppelins, hence Luftschiff. The LM series were first developed to cut anti-submarine nets that the British were dropping rather liberally outside the Flanders submarine bases. Apart from the bow-mounted net cutters, they weren't actually supposed to fight anything, instead relying on speed and stealth to accomplish their mission, and so no offensive armament was originally envisaged, although by the time they entered service, somebody had found a 37mm cannon to stick on the bow just in case. And LM5 saw the introduction of a machine gun and a single torpedo, also mounted on the bow, which, theoretically at least, allowed the LMs to go hunting. But they had relatively minimal success in this endeavour. They were no faster than contemporary destroyers, significantly less seaworthy, and although quite stealthy, they exploded distressingly easily when confronted with high-explosive shells fired by British destroyers, which they could neither outrun nor outfight. But the greater success of their opponents' navies, with the general idea of a small powerboat armed with torpedoes, encouraged further consideration of the idea. The only thorn in the side of the plan in the 1920s was that 200-ton limit on torpedo boats, as anything that was obviously armed with torpedoes might fall afoul of the Allied monitoring teams. And to get the kind of performance that was needed, it was quite clear that a boat with at least a double-digit displacement would be needed, as opposed to the handful of surviving LM boats that the Navy had been allowed to retain, which displaced less than 10 tons each. A larger craft would of course attract more attention. And so it was decided that a two-stage approach in deception would be taken. Firstly, in 1925, the High Seas Sports Association was established. This was ostensibly a civilian organisation, which also happened to allow for basic seamanship training for the much-reduced Reichsmarine, with various other similar civilian organisations and locations being government-funded to some degree or another, all in aid of furthering fast motorboat research and use. These would then test and maintain the initial craft that were under consideration. Then the idea was that when the military nature of the program could not reasonably be concealed any further, the craft would be labelled as submarine chasers, a type that was not regulated by the Versailles Treaty. At first, attention was paid, logically enough, to whatever was the fastest motorboat of the period, with a number of examples commissioned from various yards for further analysis. But the problem was that these almost exclusively used planing hulls. This was usually in the form of a relatively short, extremely shallow draft hull with a flat or near-flat underside, often referred to as a glider boat, translating directly from the German. These used the power of their engines to raise the majority of the hull out of the water, thus minimizing drag and effectively skimming across the surface. The same kind of principle used in water skiers and certain other kinds of fast motorboat today. But this came with a number of issues. On the smaller scale, there was the fact that hydrodynamic lift, which these designs relied upon, only worked past a certain speed. If you dropped below that, when the craft were moving at what might be termed a cruising speed, they were remarkably inefficient. And on the larger scale of issues was the fact that because the hull rose out of the water quite a bit when you were moving quickly, you didn't really want a deep draft or an unbalanced thrust profile, and so the boat's propeller or propellers were often quite close to the surface when running at speed, resulting in huge plumes of spray as the craft moved about. Now, this was fine for very showy racing in civilian contexts, but rather terrible for stealth in a military context. And the largest issue was that all this only really worked in relatively flat, calm environments, such as lakes and rivers. At sea, the swell of the waves would mean that either such a craft would ramp off a large wave, fly briefly and gloriously through the air in a ballistic arc, and then smash nose first into the cold, unforgiving waters of the North Sea. Or, if the waves were a little bit smaller, they would merely be subjected to a series of punishing impacts as the wave crest slammed time after time into the underside of the hull, which would be uncomfortable to say the least, would almost certainly damage the craft in short order, and would rob the craft of any built-up speed almost instantly. And so the more traditional displacement hull would be needed, as this would maintain contact with the water, thus be less subject to sudden shocks, and between the bow and the curved underside and keel, it would to a degree cut through the water and thus give a smoother and more consistent ride. Since the stern would have less variable draft than a glider boat, the propulsion system could also run a little deeper at speed, which would result in less spray and more energy going into actually moving the boat. However, a planing hull overcame the problems of drag on the hull by mostly avoiding them, and a displacement hull couldn't do that quite as much. This, of course, led to an increase in drag, among a number of other factors, and this in turn meant that displacement hulls at the time couldn't achieve anything close to as high a speed with similar power plants as the planing hull glider boats, although a displacement hull craft could be somewhat larger and fit larger engines as well. Enter the Oheka II. Built for Otto Hermann Kahn by the boatmaker Lürsen as a private venture, this craft was very light, being a metal-framed boat with a wooden hull, and although a mostly displacement hull, the stern was actually flattened underwater, somewhat reminiscent of a planing hull, which gave the stern area less resistance and more lift. Since displacement hulls tended to settle by the stern at speed, which increases drag, this was quite an innovation. To further keep the stern from settling, the engines were positioned amidships instead of right aft, which did mean a longer propeller shaft, but also meant the craft was much better balanced. Capable of 34 knots using 3 V12 engines that outputted a combined 1650 horsepower, the Oheka II was by far the fastest craft of its type when it entered service with its owner, shortly after the Reichsmarine started experimenting with various forms of powerboat. Although larger than the remaining LM boats, at around 23 tons displacement, the private motorboat was obviously not quite designed for military purposes, and so Lürsen was asked to make a larger version with the same design principles. This craft should be big enough to carry 2 detachable torpedo tubes. The detachable part was key, as testing could confirm the craft's handling with the torpedo tubes installed, but the launchers could then also be quickly removed so that in day-to-day activity the boat would look like what its hull number claimed it was, a submarine hunter, in keeping with the original concealment plans. And thus, the newly commissioned craft's first designation was UZ-S -16, or Unterseeboote Zestorer Schnell 16, literally undersea boat destroyer, but fast, number 16, the previous 15 craft being repurposed LM-type boats. This boat displaced 39 tons standard and could reach almost 40 knots when lightly loaded. This was thanks to a trio of 900 horsepower petrol engines, giving a combined total output of 2,700 horsepower via 3 screws, the rather flammable petrol power plant being selected because new lightweight high-power diesels, which had been ordered for her, turned out to not be available yet. A speed similar to her smaller ancestor of around 34 knots was found to be more practical when she was fully fueled, loaded up, and sailing in realistic sea conditions. Armament consisted of the 2 detachable torpedo tubes plus a 20mm flat gun, which was mounted aft. Ordered in 1929 and commissioned in summer 1930, she underwent extensive testing and was then renamed in March 1931 to W1, or Wachboot 1, meaning guard or watch boat. Satisfied with the general principle of the design but wanting something still larger, in April 1931 the Reichsmarine ordered 4 more craft to an enlarged design. While these were under construction, W1 was renamed again to Schnellboote 1, or Schnellboote 1, I suppose, otherwise known as S1, and thus the new class entered service in spring and summer 1932 as the S2 class. These S2 class boats displaced 49 tons and included an experimental 100 horsepower auxiliary engine designed to drive the central propeller when they were in stealth mode. That feature didn't last very long. But they also had superchargers for the engines and the installation of 2 small rudders aft of the outer props, which could be angled outwards at speed to create additional lift, improve the water flow around the screws, and reduce the wake of the craft. This feature was not actually intentional at first. When S2 was undergoing trials before delivery, a form of this effect was noticed when she was running at full power and someone put her over at full rudder. This led to an investigation as to what was causing it, which then led to trials with small rudders to replicate the effect without having to use the main rudder, and the success of those experiments led to the decision to make the small rudders a permanent feature of all Schnellboote design going forward. Like S1, S2 through 5 were fitted with detachable torpedo tubes, with Admiral Raeder issuing orders that only 1 craft at any time should have its tubes installed, and then only for as short a time as possible, basically just long enough to head out to sea and test fire them. Otherwise, the tubes were to be stored ashore, and anyone who asked if they spotted a craft at sea with torpedoes fitted would be told that the fitting was temporary for technical trials, and the launchers were intended, in fact, for a future torpedo boat class that was then being designed. It wasn't a terrible cover story, because at the time, the Reichsmarine was still using old World War I era torpedo tubes, and they did in fact need a new design of torpedo and launcher. With 5 boats now available, the first Schnellboote half flotilla was formed, and training began in early 1932, along with orders for S6 through S9, which would finally have the long-promised diesel power plants. Of these, S6 was something of a halfway house. She displaced 59 tons, but followed the same hull form as the earlier boats, but was equipped with the new MAN L7 ZN 19-30 diesels, and nothing can ever be short in Germany apparently, although these were capable of outputting just over 1,300 horsepower each when at full power, although for a limited time. They were somewhat heavier than promised, and thus the planned top speed for this class of 36 knots, or a little above that, was never practically realised, and the craft were limited to what was, for a small torpedo boat, a relatively pedestrian 32 knots instead. S7 through 9 introduced a more buoyant bow to improve seaworthiness, which also helped to make them a little bit faster than S6, And this class also introduced a brand new 21-inch torpedo tube, as opposed to the approximately 20-inch tubes found on earlier craft. A machine gun was also included, and this was a brand new MG-34, as opposed to the older MG-15 found on the first generation. 16 additional craft to this specification would be built for export, although, funnily enough, this was actually more Schnellboote than were in service with the entire Reichsmarine at the time. But, speaking of the Reichsmarine, back with them, things were moving on quite quickly. S10 through S13 were ordered with Daimler-Benz, or as we might know it now, Mercedes-Benz, MB502 engines, which had a similar power output to the L7s from MAN, but they were of a lighter weight, had better fuel efficiency, and they were fitted with superchargers, much like the petrol-driven earlier craft, and this meant that the new boats had both greater range and speed than their contemporaries, with an absolute top speed of almost 37 knots and an at-sea practical top speed of around 35 knots. But other things were also changing around them. S9 commissioned not into the Reichsmarine, but in June 1935 she instead hoisted the pennant of the Kriegsmarine. The next year, all of the S-boats were sent to Kiel, sailing around Denmark to get there, and it was found that the seakeeping of the bigger, newer craft was much superior, which, to be honest, wasn't all that much of a shock. What was more of a shock was it was found that the MAN L7 diesels suffered multiple breakdowns, while the Daimler-Benz engined craft cruised quite serenely. This didn't bode too well for S14 through S17, which were under construction at the time, also with MAN engines, albeit of an L11 design. Although larger still compared to their predecessors at around 92 tons, these engines would also prove somewhat troublesome, and as a result the decision was made to proceed with Daimler-Benz engines in future classes, if at all possible. The older, smaller and petrol-powered S1 through S5, along with the most troublesome of the diesel boats, the S6, were thus scheduled for quick decommissioning and sale, being transferred to Spain in late 1936. Confusingly, this led to the reuse of the early S numbers later on in the war, but we'll cover that later. The end of that year saw S18 through S25 being ordered. These were essentially S14 type boats, but instead of the MAN engines, they had MB501 engines from Daimler-Benz. And they also had the final piece of the S-boat hydrodynamic puzzle, a wedge-shaped water deflector mounted under the stern, which further ensured that the craft would stay close to horizontal when moving at high speed, as it worked to raise the stern still further out of the water. With the MB501s, each capable of just over 2,000 horsepower at full bore, these craft could reach almost 40 knots quite reliably. But the main story for the S-boats at this point looked like it wasn't going to be the unification of all the features that would make a classic S-boat in the upcoming war, but would instead be the performance of the first of their type, as they were just arriving at a time when the Spanish Civil War was getting underway. A small contingent of the S-boat crews back in the Kriegsmarine volunteered, in heavy quotation marks, to head to Spain to train the nationalist forces in the operation of their old craft. Hilariously, for listeners of this channel, although the exported S-boats were initially brought to Spain aboard the freighter Hohenfels, they were soon found to suffer rather badly in the heavy Atlantic swells of northern and northwestern Spanish coasts, and so they were quickly relocated to a port near Cadiz on the deck of another freighter. Its name, wait for it, was the Drachenfels. Here, the S3 was damaged beyond repair when the support cradle she was in collapsed while she was being craned off the ship, but the remaining craft survived and were renamed Badajoz, Falange, Requete, Oviedo, and Toledo. But, as fate would have it, a combination of apparently somewhat unwilling Spanish crews, they were suspected of sabotaging their own boat so they didn't have to go anywhere, and the vagaries of the Civil War meant that the craft didn't actually get to accomplish all that much except for accidentally crippling the British destroyer HMS Hunter by laying a minefield, which had actually been laid to try and catch some of the Republican naval assets, not much larger, much nastier ships on neutrality patrols. But back in Germany, with the power plant of future craft decided as being MB501s for the foreseeable future, as these were, somewhat confusingly, improved version of the MB502, it was decided to standardize production going forward. A final feature that gave what would become pretty much the distinctive S-boat profile was incorporated into the S-26, that being enclosing the torpedo tubes in the hull instead of mounting them atop the hull, and this allowed the entire bow to be raised, which gave even better seakeeping and buoyancy. S-26 through S-29 were ordered in spring 1938, remaining at around 92 tons standard displacement and capable of around 39 knots with an armament of 2 torpedo tubes, each of which had a reload, plus a pair of 20mm cannon. They were joined on the stocks by 8 other craft, which were fractionally smaller and used the older MB502 engines, but these were destined for the Chinese Nationalist Navy. Although very, very similar, their fractionally smaller size made them slightly faster. But then the outbreak of World War II saw all of those export-destined craft taken over for use by the Kriegsmarine, which had planned to have over 70 Schnellboote in service before any war broke out, but with the significantly earlier than expected advent of conflict, they were left scrambling to find basically any ship they could stick a gun or torpedo on. By now, with the S-18 class still only just coming into commission, as it did take a while to build them, there were 2 S-boat flotillas, one based at Kiel in the Baltic, and the other at Heligoland in the North Sea. The Kiel-based first flotilla had more and more modern craft, and they found themselves patrolling off the Polish coast on the 1st of September 1939 under the overall notional command of the rather ambitiously titled Führer der Torpedoboote, who happened to be one Günther Lütjens. I wonder where he'll turn up later. Anyway, at this point he was aboard a large destroyer, not a torpedo boat, but there you go. At first, nothing much happened. The main duty of the Schnellboote turned out to be taking messages back and forth between various patrolling German destroyers. But the next day, they found a steamer that was being used by the Polish Navy. They decided such a craft wasn't worth a torpedo, and so the S-boats allowed the crew to evacuate the ship before hosing it down with much of their 20mm ammunition, eventually causing it to sink, although whether the steamer sank out of pure boredom is up for debate. But with the Polish Navy either bombed in port or already escaped to destinations unknown, there was nothing much else for the S-boats to do, and so First Flotilla was soon sent via the Kiel Canal to join the Second Flotilla in the North Sea. Here they patrolled, unsuccessfully, trying to catch the Polish submarine Orzel as it made its own escape. And they awaited the arrival of reinforcements as the S-26 and S-30 classes were finally beginning to hit the water. As well as eliminating portholes along the hull, the new craft also had a much-welcomed feature, a small open cockpit above the enclosed bridge. This allowed the ship's captain, or boat's captain I suppose, to have a much better view of what was going on, but they could still easily give orders to the men who were now literally below them, as well as figuratively, as the bridge sheltered those men and their sensitive equipment. Somewhat optimistically, the S-boats were now used largely in the role that they'd originally been given purely as a cover, that of submarine chasers. It turned out that with a relatively low horizon and no sonar or hydrophones to speak of, they were singularly unsuited for this job, their only real qualification at all being that it was possible to carry a few depth charges. Attempts to use them as escorts for other surface ships also went badly, as they were forced to operate far below their designed operating speeds, which usually meant just running on their central engine, which of course put a fair amount of strain on that engine, and pushed maintenance schedules around, as it meant that the power plants on the various craft were now out of sync in terms of their mileage. Faced with apparent confusion on what exactly the Kriegsmarine was supposed to be using these boats for, a few of them were loaded with mines and directed in the vague direction of the British coast in the hope that that might be a more productive activity. Meanwhile, more S-boats were under construction. S-38 through 53 were essentially repeats of the S-26 type, with very minor differences, and with the Lursen yard approaching build capacity, the blueprints were also given to the Schlichting Werft at Travemünde, and in an attempt to distinguish which yards had built which boats, those craft were numbered starting at 101, so the order was for S-101 through S-108 there. This was an unhelpful version of a similar attempt to distinguish the yard sourcing of German destroyers in World War I, although at least there they'd had the good grace to use letters instead of numbers. Additionally, S-54 through S-61 would be ordered as repeats of the S-30 type, as it allowed the use of the MB-502 engines, whereas the MB-501s were getting in somewhat short supply. The two existing flotillas struggled on through a miserable icy winter, with the only real highlights being some storm damage, a collision or two, and a few more craft entering service. But then, in April 1940, came the invasion of Norway. Here, Group 3, headed for Bergen, was supported by the first flotilla, with S-19 through to S-22 and S-24, while the second flotilla supported Group 4, which was headed for Kristiansand, with S7, S8, S17, and S30 through 33. The Bergen group temporarily lost an S-boat almost as soon as they left port, as thick fog, which would be a recurring theme for the next few months, caused S19 to ram S21, much to the former's detriment, and S19 then had to drop out for repairs. For the rest of the first flotilla, the assault was lively, but largely without incident for them, as the cruiser Königsberg acted as a rather useful distraction and punching bag for the Norwegian shore batteries, so the S-boats were allowed to busy themselves with ferrying troops ashore, with S-24 taking some time out of this schedule to capture a small Norwegian mine layer. In due course, Königsberg would suffer the near-ultimate humiliation of actually being sunk by Fleet Aeron skewers, and with the Köln and other surface units withdrawing back to Germany to avoid such a fate, First Flotilla, now one boat up on its original strength thanks to the arrival of S-23 and S-25, was left as pretty much the sum-total defence of Bergen and the surrounding areas, with a small array of auxiliary ships, a training ship, a tender, and a minesweeper, which provided some questionable backup, although those larger auxiliaries did tend to have slightly more gun firepower. Unfamiliar with confined Norwegian coastal waters, the S-boats' hulls soon resembled the victims of repeated destruction derbies, as they had a habit of running into things, mostly submerged rocks, and some of the props looked like they were the survivors of particularly vicious rodent assaults. Nonetheless, occasional revisits by skewers aside, which were bad for morale, they managed to get their first proper action of the war when S-19, S-21 and S-23 went out on a recon sweep of Hardangersfjord on the 18th of April. Here, the S-21 and 23 encountered the Norwegian torpedo boat Sail. Commissioned in 1901, the venerable old Sail was older than some of the S-boat's crew's fathers, and was by far the oldest thing or person present in this combat. Barely larger than her opponents, and about half as fast, the Sail did nonetheless have one advantage. Her primary armament was a pair of 37mm cannon that meant she was by far the most heavily armed of the three craft, at least in terms of gun-based surface warfare. Initially, the encounter went quite badly for the Germans. They attempted high-speed strafing runs using their own 20mm cannon, but this only got the S-21 crippled and listing by a burst of 37mm gunfire. S-23 then swooped in to try and distract the Norwegian ship from finishing off the S-21, and got incredibly lucky. A 20mm round knocked out one of the 37mm guns, and then the firing mechanism of the other gun broke at almost exactly the same time. This suddenly left Sail with only a machine gun left to cover them, and so the torpedo boat made for the shore. Both S-boats fired torpedoes, but Sail barely drew any more water than they did, and the weapon simply passed directly underneath her. Unfortunately for the brave Norwegian ship, though, one of the torpedoes that was launched hit a submerged rock right next to her as she passed it. The resulting explosion blew a hole in her bow and left her crippled and stuck ashore by the stern as the crew made their way to safety. S-19, having heard the gunfire, showed up, and between them, the S-19 and 23 would help S-21 restart its engines before they all headed off after reports of another Norwegian warship somewhere in the vicinity. The mixed German forces available in the area, which included the 5 undamaged S-boats, were then soon gathered to assault the area in general and take the base that Sail and a few other ships had been operating from. This resulted in a conflict in which another S-boat was damaged, this time by the minelayer Tyr, before it was captured in turn by another S-boat after one of the auxiliaries managed to score a crippling hit on the Tyr with a well-placed shell. On the 25th, S-19, 23 and 25 found a number of merchant ships hovering at the town of Ulvik and attempted to capture these as well, only to then be ambushed by Norwegian infantry ashore who opened fire. The minesweeper M1 then showed up and counterattacked the ambushers who were firing on S-19's crew, but the action bought enough time for the Norwegians to scuttle the 2 larger ships, denying Germany about 9,000 tons of precious merchant shipping and leaving them only with the consolation prize of the 162-ton Eidfjord. Elsewhere, 2nd Flotilla had opened their part in the campaign with a similar troop-ferrying role, minus the collisions, and then made off with a rather wide variety of captured Norwegian naval equipment and small ships once Kristiansand fell. They also found and liberated the Type 2 German U-boat U-21, which had run aground the previous month in Norwegian waters and been interned before the outbreak of hostilities. The S-boat flotillas could therefore be relatively happy. They'd been quite useful, and unlike the rest of the Kriegsmarine, they hadn't actually lost any of their craft, although some had been damaged, and the S9, 14 and 16 had essentially bricked themselves when their MAN engines had seized up, but at least there hadn't been any casualties, and they were still a useful source of spare parts for the other boats. So, broadly, the overall strength of the flotillas had actually increased, as new boats had commissioned during the first third of 1940 at a faster rate than others had managed to disassemble themselves. But there was no time to rest on laurels. The 2nd Flotilla was soon being summoned back to the North Sea, as preparations were being made to invade France, Belgium and the Netherlands, although their first encounter with the Marine Nationale was actually when a number of French destroyers raided the Skagerrak. While the German army gathered its strength, the S-boats found themselves assisting mine-laying efforts to try and secure their new Norwegian holdings. It was here that the S-boats would have their first run-in with the Royal Navy. S-30 through 34 were on patrol in various areas as S-13, which was with them, had been detached for engine repairs, when word came in of a hostile force closing in on German mine-layers just to the west of the Fisher Bank. What had happened was the British force, consisting of the cruiser Birmingham along with the destroyers Kelly, Kandahar and Bulldog, were indeed out looking for German mine-layers, but they'd been somewhat distracted when they'd encountered the submarine U-32. The destroyers had pursued it and depth-charged it, although ultimately unsuccessfully, and they were heading back to the cruiser when they ran into a Dornier 18 flying boat, just as night and fog began to close in. The flying boat had withdrawn out of anti-aircraft range and then radioed in the sighting report, in a rare example of Luftwaffe Kriegsmarine cooperation. Thus, at around 22:45 that night, lookouts aboard the Kelly spotted something in the water just 600 yards away, mostly thanks to the fog rather than the darkness. This something turned out to be S-31 and S-34, the former of which had just fired both her torpedo tubes. Moments later, a plume of water erupted alongside the Kelly, and the forward boiler room was immediately flooded as a 50-foot hole had been ripped into her side, and she coasted to a halt, heeling heavily to starboard as steam vented out of her hull. Convinced that such a rapid and dramatic fate meant that the ship surely was doomed, and unwilling to risk either its revenge fire or encounters with potential friends who might be nearby, the 2 S-boats promptly withdrew. However, the Bulldog, trailing somewhat behind the other 2, stumbled across the stricken Kelly and took her under tow. The fog thickened, and then, just after midnight, with it now therefore being the 9th of May, the lookouts on Bulldog heard the noise of diesel engines at full throttle. They were slightly confused, and then out of nowhere S-33 appeared moving at full pelt and at basically point-blank range. And before either ship could react, the racing S-boat struck Bulldog a glancing blow, bounced off, and then hit Kelly just where her forecastle stepped down, scraping along the side, on the awash starboard side of the vessel, and vanishing off into the fog. Of course, both British ships outmassed S-33 by an order of magnitude and more, and their hull plating was steel as opposed to wood, so apart from a couple of ships' boats knocked loose on Kelly, the crews of the destroyers were left equally confused and amused by the sudden and short-lived ramming incident, and so, after having checked for scuffed paintwork and spraying the area with a few rounds, they elected to simply continue onwards into the fog. Meanwhile, S-33 was in considerably worse shape. 2 compartments were flooded and the starboard bow was completely smashed in. The boat had been fully colarinderized by various small arms fire which had been brought to bear as she'd passed, and the engines were dead. Although it turned out that the engines were dead because the helmsman had been knocked off his feet by the collision and fallen on the throttle. This turned out to actually be a good thing, as the sounds of the nearby blind firing informed the German crew their craft was still within a couple of 100 feet of the British ships, which gives you some idea of just how thick the fog was. If the engines had still been running, that blind fire might have been distressingly more accurate. After initially setting scuttling charges, convinced they were doomed, they then found the issue with the throttle, and that the engines therefore could be restarted, and so S-33 elected, rather than sink itself, to gingerly make its way first out of audible range of the destroyers, and then back across the North Sea, successfully making it back to Wilhelmshaven later in the day, somewhat slower than its contemporaries. Overall, though, the encounter was deemed quite the success. Although S-33 did need a new bow, the much larger and far more dangerous Kelly was going to be out of action for the rest of the year, and at the time, of course, the Kriegsmarine believed she'd been sunk outright. The next day, the invasion of France began, and soon, with the rapid advances of the German army, various ports in the English Channel were becoming available, and with memories of the Kaiserliche Marine operations in the area during World War I, urgent requests were sent to relocate S-boats to the new front. Initially, this was resisted as there was still fighting to be had in Norway, and with Kriegsmarine numbers reduced so much by the campaign thus far, it turned out the S-boats were essentially the largest coherent Kriegsmarine surface force available in any kind of numbers. But by the 19th of May, both flotillas were in fact ordered to take up new stations in the recently captured port of Den Helder in the Netherlands. From here, they engaged in various sweeps looking for Allied shipping, winning a fight with a flight of Avro Ansons, shooting one down for no damage, while on the night of the 21st of May, they did score a torpedo hit on something, although exactly what they hit and what happened to it still remains unconfirmed. But their primary attention was soon drawn to the gathering forces who were preparing for the evacuation operations off of Dunkirk. Specifically, they were aiming at the picket line of destroyers that had been established to prevent Kriegsmarine interference with said planned evacuation. Although some attacks were, of course, unsuccessful, S-23 managed to score the first unequivocal warship kill of the S-boat flotillas just before 0100 on the 23rd of May, when she torpedoed the French Chacal-class large destroyer Jaguar, which was set on fire by the explosion and had to be beached. However, the next few days were exercises in frustration as torpedoes went wide, targets evaded them, or in the case of an otherwise textbook-perfect attack on the destroyer HMS Vega, the torpedoes detonated prematurely. On the 27th of May, the evacuation at Dunkirk formally began, and with almost no other naval assets available, the Kriegsmarine High Command ordered the S-boats to intensify their attacks. But they themselves were coming under more pressure, as the Allies had recognized the threat that they posed, and RAF aircraft were regularly sweeping the seas for them. It seems to be at this point that the term E-boat is first encountered, in the form of these aircraft being assigned to anti-E-boat sweeps. The Schnellboote would thus be dubbed E-boats in much wartime and post-war English language literature, although exactly why they were called this remains, technically speaking, unknown, albeit most attempts to track down the term's origins tend to arrive at somebody shortening the term enemy boat or enemy motorboat to E-boat. In the morning of the 28th of May, the S-34 then managed to sink the small steamer Abukir, continuing the run of misfortune that British ships with that particular name have had in the face of German torpedo-armed attack craft in world wars, although the first set of torpedoes had missed and S-34 had to reload and try again. The next night, which was technically the same day, S-30 claimed the destroyer HMS Wakeful, which was loaded with evacuating troops. In the morning of the 31st of May, the S-24 scored a hit on the French destroyer Cyclone, although she would be successfully towed, if slowly, to Dover by the Polish Błyskawica. But her nearby sister ship Sirocco, which had been attacked a few days earlier without any success, now had considerably less luck as she was hit by torpedoes from both S-23 and S-26. Like Wakeful, she was also heavily laden with troops, and she sank in less than 2 minutes. Also like Wakeful, there were only a handful of survivors. That evening, S-34 and S-35 managed to add the armed trawlers Stella Dorado and Argyllshire to their tally, and at this point the S-boats had moved from Den Helder to the Hook of Holland, but they were also coming under increasing amounts of air attack, and between this and the increased use of star shells, searchlights and flares, their attempts to attack various Allied ships in the early days of June were essentially frustrated. Even the arrival of the newly created Third Flotilla and some support from the Luftwaffe couldn't seem to break the impasse, and thus no further ships would be sunk by the Schnellboote during the closing stages of Operation Dynamo. Instead, the craft would be relocated again to the recently occupied port of Boulogne, which was still mildly on fire from the occupation efforts, and this was all in aid of trying to expand S-boat operations across the Channel. In recognition of their success thus far, another 17 boats had been ordered in early June, following the S-26 pattern. These would be S-62 through 69 and S-109 through 117. Midway through this run, a much-requested armoured bridge would begin to be installed as standard, something that would then be retrofitted to many older craft and came as a welcome relief for the crews, because although at this point no S-boat had yet been lost in direct combat, a number of officers and men had been injured or killed by shrapnel, splinters, and strafing by machine guns, which had punched through the wood and glass bridge structures of their existing craft with an almost contemptuous ease. But this move from Dutch to French ports would mark the beginning of the longest and most active campaign that the S-boats would fight, the Channel War.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.